Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, in my ongoing series on Baldur's Gate itemization, we're covering Cloaks. Cloaks are a really interesting item slot in Baldur's Gate 3 character optimization, and they're often overlooked because there's very few of them. There's only 5, 10, 15, 17 cloaks, whereas many other item slots have double or more that in terms of items. And in general, they have relatively minor effects. They also don't start appearing until Act 2, so it's pretty easy to overlook the power that these give to your characters. That being said, an important principle in strategy games, and something that's always worth thinking about when you're planning a build or a strategy, is that the difference in strategy games between a good player and a great player is that the good player will generally make good decisions, but the great player will get small edges where other players wouldn't find them. Cloaks give us an avenue to do that, where we can make sure that we are improving our characters as much as possible, even on the abilities and items that offer relatively minor effects. So as we go through the game, we're going to be just that much stronger than other characters if we're using the right cloak, and get the smug sense of satisfaction that comes with knowing that you're playing well in a way that most players are playing badly. Just as with my armor and shields tier lists, I'll be rating these cloaks based on their power level at the time when you first get access to them. Though, since they don't start appearing until Act 2, with one exception, the cloaks in the top tiers are much more likely to remain best in slot throughout the entire game for the characters that they're good for. In S tier, I'm placing cloaks that are best in slot for a wide array of builds or certain very powerful builds. In A tier, cloaks that are interesting alternatives to the S tier options, or are good for very particular, specific builds. In B tier, ones that have interesting usage for some parties or some encounters, or might be an alternative that you could swap in, given your party composition. In C tier, cloaks that most parties won't be able to use, but do have a narrow use case available within the game. And in D tier, ones that most parties will be unable to use, and you can just use them as Gale food. Now, of course, because they don't show up until Act 2, by the time you get these cloaks, Gale won't want to eat them anymore, but if he doesn't get enough fiber, how will he grow up big and strong? So really, you've just got to make him. Alright, let's get started rating cloaks. First up, we have a nice easy one, the non-magical cloak. These do start appearing in Act 1, but have no magical effect. None of the variants of the non-magical cloak without any enchantments have an effect in the game, and as far as I know, there's no Easter eggs or story events associated with any of them, so there's no reason to bother with these. D tier. Next up, the Deathstalker Mantle. This is a Dark Urge specific item, only available to players using the Dark Urge origin, so there will probably be some minor Dark Urge spoilers as I'm discussing this item. If you're trying to avoid those because you haven't played a Dark Urge run yet, then feel free to skip ahead to the next item. The Deathstalker Mantle is available only to Dark Urge players, and is the only magical cloak available in Act 1, which is already a pretty significant mechanical draw to playing a Dark Urge, because you get to use an item slot that nobody else gets to use a full act early. The Deathstalker Mantle gives you a use for your cloak slot when everyone else is just running around with whatever the best die you have available is, just to look cool rather than be more powerful. The Deathstalker Mantle also is incredibly powerful, and of course because it is a story item, the fact that it is absurdly broken makes sense. It's just intended to be there for story purposes, not because it's a balanced item to exist within the game. The Deathstalker Mantle gives you, whenever you kill an enemy once per turn, you become invisible for 2 turns. Invisibility is an incredibly powerful effect in Baldur's Gate and makes it extremely difficult for most enemies to find and attack you. There are very few enemies in the game who can see through invisibility, so the Deathstalker Mantle just makes you really good at avoiding taking damage. Whenever you kill an enemy is a pretty easy condition to fulfill. It's something that you can do relatively reliably on your turn with most damage-oriented builds, and so passive invisibility that activates after you've already taken your turn without spending an action or anything like that is of course incredibly powerful for keeping your character alive. It's especially synergistic for builds like a melee dagger build or an open hand monk or something along those lines that are relatively squishy and melee characters, so they can get in, kill an enemy using their very high damage output, and then be perfectly safe because they enter invisibility. Of course, it's also incredible for solo characters, because when your only character is invisible 100% of the time when it's not your turn, the enemies will often be completely unable to do anything to you, so the Deathstalker Mantle makes playing a solo character extremely easy. All of that together is obviously an insanely strong benefit. The Deathstalker Mantle is intended to be a broken item reward for playing the Dark Urge character, and it fills that perfectly. Obviously, some characters will not be able to make tremendous use of this ability. If you are playing a support character or a low damage output character that doesn't, or a debuffing or controlling character that doesn't intend to get kills, then the Deathstalker Mantle won't be as powerful for you. But for any character that intends to kill enemies, which is most characters in Dungeons & Dragons, this is going to be the best in slot item because of just how incredibly strong it is. A couple caveats with this item, just some things to be aware of. The effect won't trigger if you kill an enemy through a lot of sources of indirect damage. There's many sources of damage in the game that don't count as coming from the originating character. So if you kill enemies by exploding a barrel, you won't get the invisibility. If you kill enemies by reducing them below the hit point threshold of Cull the Weak, then you won't get the invisibility, because it doesn't count as you killing the enemy. If you kill an enemy using Moonbeam, and there's a bunch of others, but those are the ones that come up the most often as being damage sources that don't count as coming from you, so you don't get the invisibility because of various bugs associated with those items. Obviously, this is intended to be the best in slot item for a Dark Urge character, and for them to wear it throughout the game, and you're definitely going to do that, so it is of course going straight into S tier. The Cloak of Cunning Brume. So firstly, I really like the name of this cloak. I like that it could have been called the Cloak of Fog or whatever, but they were like, you know what, let's teach everyone a new word. The Cloak of Cunning Brume is one of the reasons I wanted to do this tier list, because this might be my single favorite item in the entire game. If not, it's pretty darn close. Not necessarily from a pure power standpoint, although it's also quite powerful, but it's one of the items that offers the most room for interesting and unique strategies in the entire game. How it works is that whenever the wearer disengages, so whenever you use the disengage action that lets you leave melee range without provoking an attack of opportunity, you cast a cloud of fog. It's a fog cloud, just identical to the spell with all of the same effects, but only 7 feet in radius compared to the spell's 15 feet, so it's a much smaller AoE. It blinds everyone inside of it, prevents creatures without dark vision from seeing into the effect, so you can hide inside of it, and basically just lets you cast Fog Cloud without spending a spell slot by using your disengage action. Already, that's pretty powerful, because that's a pretty decent spell, so getting a first level spell for free just whenever you want it is pretty nice. But there's a lot of combinations with this item that make it particularly interesting. Unlike a lot of the other cloaks, this one is better for specific builds, and also better for specific players, because it does take some patience and some game knowledge to get the most use out of it, but it's incredibly powerful, so the ceiling is very high on using this cloak. Firstly, when combined with any character that can disengage as a bonus action, like a rogue, you can gain a fog cloud as a bonus action, which obviously is incredibly strong. Being able to cast a spell as a bonus action is always a very powerful effect, especially when it doesn't cost you a resource. That works especially well with rogues, because you can then use that to gain advantage on attacking enemies. So you can use this to self-trigger sneak attack by blinding the enemy and gaining advantage on your attacks against them. If you combine this with blind immunity so that you yourself are immune to the effects, or if you use careful positioning to make sure that the enemy is on the edge of the fog cloud, and then you can create the fog cloud, walk out of it, and stab the enemy who's blinded. Alongside of that, you get a lot of out-of-combat utility. You can always steal things and lockpick without spending resources on blinding enemies or creating fog clouds around them, so you can commit crimes with relative impunity. And it's especially cool if you can trap enemies in the location, so something like a rogue build with Sentinel that can keep enemies trapped inside of the fog cloud can get a lot of use out of the Cloak of Cunning Brume. It's definitely not for every character, because many characters will not want to spend their actions in combat casting Disengage, but for the characters it's good for, it's actually quite powerful, and the sheer array of creative uses for this item gives it a pretty significant boost in power level, once you start exploring the different ways that you can use it. For that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier, because it's best for certain strategies. But the power level is definitely there, because it gives you such a cool and unique effect. So A tier feels pretty good. In general, most characters are going to be better off with something that gives you a passive bonus, but for the characters that this is good for, it's awesome. The Cloak of Elemental Absorption. So this is available later on in Act 2. Obviously, it's going to depend on what order you do Act 2 in, but for most playthroughs, you will already have some other cloaks available by the time you get this one. So you won't just be comparing it to an empty slot, you'll actually be deciding whether to equip it over a different cloak. The Cloak of Elemental Absorption gives you the ability to take half damage from any elemental damage that is incoming once per short rest. You can spend your reaction and take half damage from an elemental attack. This is pretty good if you're about to take a single large instance of elemental damage, let's say something like a fireball or a big explosion or a lightning bolt, or an enemy who casts chain lightning. So if you know you're going into a fight where the enemy uses a lot of elemental damage, this effect can help keep you alive. That being said, if you're going into a fight where you know the enemy uses a lot of elemental damage, you can often just gain resistance using gear or elixirs to that kind of elemental damage, and not mess around with spending your reaction on reducing it. The Elemental Absorption Cloak does work as a good panic button, though. If you take a big elemental hit that you weren't expecting, then you can reduce it. And also, when you do reduce it, you gain an extra 1d6 of that elemental damage on your next attack. Specifically, this only works with weapon attacks, so it's not very good for spellcasters, but the extra 1d6 damage is a nice little bonus for activating this ability. For the most part, this is more a nice-to-have than something that you're specifically going to seek out. You're never going to be sad to have it equipped, because it will come up occasionally, and you can just reduce some incoming damage. But for the most part, the Cloak of Elemental Absorption isn't super worth going out of your way for. It's a purely defensive ability, or rather one that requires you to activate it defensively before you can use it offensively, and those are typically worse than abilities that are more offensive in nature, because proactivity is often better than reactivity. But the Cloak of Elemental Absorption is a nice role player, and one that you will never be sad to have equipped, so I'm going to put it in B tier. I think that there are, generally speaking, better passive benefits, but this one can work out if you're about to take a big elemental hit. The Cloak of Protection. This is, for most playthroughs again, probably one of the first cloaks you're going to encounter. So a lot of the time you're just going to be equipping this over having nothing equipped. And it gives you +1 armor class and +1 to your saving throws. +1 armor class and +1 to saving throws permanently all the time is obviously really powerful, very good defensively for a wide array of characters. Many characters can use these small bonuses to their armor class or small bonuses to their saves to patch a weakness in the build, or you can use it on top of a build that's already defensively powerful to make it even harder to hurt. I don't really need to go into why these are great benefits, but they are great benefits, and even though the numbers are small, the Cloak of Protection is excellent, because every point that you have in these abilities makes each subsequent point even more valuable, so the Cloak of Protection is just excellent, going straight into S tier, and someone in your party will almost certainly be wearing this throughout the entire game. The Derivation Cloak. The Derivation Cloak lets you heal for 1d4 whenever you poison a foe. Poisoning a foe in this context specifically means applying the poisoned condition, not dealing poison damage or anything like that. The poisoned condition, which you can use through like weapon coatings that apply it, or other certain spells will allow you to apply it, or certain item effects. When an enemy's poisoned, they get disadvantage on their attack rolls, which is a reasonably powerful debuff, so it's something that you wouldn't mind doing occasionally. Getting an extra d4 hit points for when you do it is okay, but certainly not something to get excited about. The idea behind this item, though, is to use it as part of a combo of 3 specific items: the Derivation Cloak, the Broodmother's Revenge, and the Poisoner's Gloves. The Poisoner's Gloves poisons an enemy whenever you deal poison damage to them. They have to make a con save or become poisoned. And the Broodmother's Revenge says that whenever you heal, you gain a weapon coating that does 1d6 of poison damage. So together, those 3 items let you hit an enemy, potentially poisoning them. If you poison them, then you heal, and then if you do that, then you gain extra poison damage, which can then poison that enemy, which can then heal, which can gain extra poison damage, and so on. That little mini combo is pretty cool, but altogether you're dedicating 3 item slots for a small amount of healing, a marginal debuff with a very weak saving throw, it's DC 13, and a little bit of extra poison damage every round. So while it's a cool combo that exists in the game and pretty fun to use as a character, the overall effect is not worth dedicating 3 of your item slots for, including your very valuable glove slot. So generally speaking, the Derivation Cloak isn't part of a powerful strategy. Without those other items, it does almost nothing, and with those items, it's only okay. So I'm going to put it in C tier, because there is a build that works around this combo. It's just unfortunately not an incredibly strong build. Definitely playable, but not one that's going to be part of a highly optimized party in general. The Fleshmelter Cloak. This item kind of annoys me because it has such a metal name for such a minor effect. The Fleshmelter Cloak deals 1d4 acid damage to any enemy that hits you in melee. And specifically, you have to actually take melee damage from them, that you have to take hit point damage in order for them to receive the 1d4 acid damage, which is kind of annoying because the natural home for the Fleshmelter Cloak would be on like an Abjuration Wizard or something like that, but if you block all of the incoming damage with Arcane Ward, then the Fleshmelter Cloak doesn't actually trigger, so the enemies won't take the damage. That is a fairly irritating minor point. Overall, this item is still fine. Retaliation damage is still very good on retaliation damage builds, so you can use this on a Barbarian alongside Fire Shield and something like that. And it's still fine for an Abjuration Wizard. You can still use it, and whenever an enemy hits you with a big hit, they take a little bit of additional damage. And even for just any normal character that expects to get hit regularly in combat, a Barbarian or Fighter, if you take a hit, the Fleshmelter Cloak adds a little bit of extra damage to your party, so it's effectively free value, a little bit of additional DPS, it never hurts. Acid damage is also rarely resisted, so usually you'll get the additional damage. There are some damage rider bugs on lower difficulty settings, on Tactician or below. You can have this additional damage trigger a bunch of damage riders and deal quite high retaliation damage, but on Honor mode, most of those have been fixed, so it will usually only be the 1d4 additional acid damage. 1d4 additional acid damage when you get hit is fine. It's not something that we're excited about, but it's certainly something that we will use, especially on a build that intends to take frequent hits. So I'll put it in B tier, just because it's mostly free value. Overall, though, not a very exciting item. The Thunderskin Cloak. The Thunderskin Cloak gives you, when a creature with reverberation on them, so you have to have another item or effect that produces reverberation on an enemy, and they have to have been hit by that effect, deals damage to the wearer, and it's any kind of damage, doesn't have to be melee damage. They need to make a con save or become dazed. This con save is always DC 13, excuse me, and cannot be boosted by items. So DC 13 Constitution save, con is typically the worst save to target, because enemies will often have extremely high Constitution saves. And so a DC 13 Constitution save is just not usually going to get the job done, and enemies won't become dazed. Dazed gives enemies a bunch of minor debuffs. It reduces their armor class slightly, prevents them from taking reactions, and gives them disadvantage on wisdom saving throws. So altogether, Dazed is an okay package to inflict, but it's very unlikely to actually happen, even if you meet the incredibly specific conditions that this item requires to trigger. You need to both have a reverberation build somewhere in your party and have the enemy have reverberation, but not have shut them down, not have prevented them from attacking you, which most Reverberation builds are designed to do, then you need to take a hit from this character and have them fail a DC 13 con save, and then have the daze be relevant. Preventing enemies from making reactions is reasonably powerful in Baldur's Gate, but you want to do that proactively so that you can then cast a spell without them counterspelling it or move out of their threatened area, not reactively. Dazing them on their turn is much less likely to give you something that you actually need, so even if this does trigger, it's just not very good. The Thunderskin Cloak provides an incredibly minor benefit and is extremely unlikely to ever actually trigger, so I'm putting it into D tier. It's such a cool idea for an item, like thematically it's very cool, but the Thunderskin Cloak, unfortunately, they slapped so many restrictions on this item that it will never actually do anything. And finally, the last of the Act 2 available cloaks, the Vivacious Cloak. This cloak gives you 8 temporary hit points whenever you cast a spell while in melee. So if you have the threatened condition from an enemy and you cast a spell, you get 8 temporary hit points. Those temporary hit points go away after 4 turns, so you can't carry them over from combat to combat, but obviously when you're using this in combat, you're probably just using it to be able to tank a hit when you move out of opportunity attack range. This is a pretty nice benefit for a spellcaster, because you can cast a spell and then move out of opportunity attack range and absorb some of the damage, or just cast a spell and gain a little buffer to your hit points if your spell doesn't kill that enemy or if another enemy targets you. As a purely defensive benefit, the main question here is the Vivacious Cloak better than the Cloak of Protection? And the answer is no. Most characters are going to benefit more in terms of staying alive from the Cloak of Protection, but the Vivacious Cloak is pretty reasonable. It doesn't require you to have a leveled spell or anything, so even a cantrip gives you the additional temporary hit points. And if you get stuck in melee, you're going to want, with a spellcaster, you're going to want to cast a spell, and you're going to be worried about that spellcaster surviving if they're stuck in melee. The Vivacious Cloak helps them do that. It's just a solid item for any spellcaster. Since not everybody can wear a Cloak of Protection, since there's only one, the Vivacious Cloak is definitely the next best thing, and so most parties are going to end up with a spellcaster that has this equipped. I'm putting it in A tier because it is good for a specific build, but the Vivacious Cloak is also just a solid item that you will be happy to have. Special mention for Spore Druids as well, who can use this in some ways to refresh their Spore Shield. The 8 temporary hit points do still go away, but this can keep your Spore Shield from breaking, which is pretty valuable for Spore Druids. It has a weird interaction with other sources of temporary hit points, where sometimes it will not go away after the 4 turns, and sometimes it will. I think basically the game decides which source of temporary hit points takes precedence, and does so in a slightly arcane way, so the Vivacious Cloak will sometimes give you permanent temporary hit points if you have some other temporary hit points when you gain this benefit. And also can help you gain additional damage from Armour of Agathis if your Armour of Agathis is about to break. So there's a couple little combos with this, but mostly it's just for extra survival. Putting it all together at the end of Act 2, a non-Dark Urge party will 100% of the time have the Cloak of Protection equipped, and then almost always have the Vivacious Cloak equipped if you have any spellcasting character. If you have a character who can use it, you'll have the Cloak of Cunning Brume, otherwise you'll have the 2 B-tier cloaks, and if you do have the Cloak of Cunning Brume equipped, you'll pick whichever of the Cloak of Elemental Absorption and the Fleshmelter Cloak is more useful to your party, given your party composition. As a default option, I'd recommend the Elemental Absorption Cloak over the Fleshmelter Cloak if you don't have a character who's going to take a lot of hits, and if you do have that character, you can also consider just putting them in the Cloak of Protection and taking fewer hits instead. Alright, let's get to Act 3. In Act 3, we get access to the Cindermoth Cloak. The Cindermoth Cloak sets any enemy who deals damage to us on fire. Specifically an enemy who damages us from within 7 feet, so just slightly outside of melee range. Doesn't have to be a melee attack, but since it's basically melee range, it will almost always be melee enemies that are actually affected by the Cindermoth Cloak's ability. Enemies who hit you have to make a DC 12 dexterity saving throw, or they catch fire. A DC 12 dex save is trivial for most Act 3 enemies. Dex is the second worst ability to target after Constitution in most cases, and most enemies will pass a DC 12 dexterity save with ease, and even if they fail it, all that they get is the burning condition, which deals 1d4 fire damage per round. The Fleshmelter Cloak does exactly the same thing, but does the damage immediately, which is better, rather than waiting, and also doesn't have a saving throw associated with it. The Cindermoth Cloak does work against enemies that are making non-melee attacks, so there are some enemies that it will work against that the Fleshmelter won't, but in almost all circumstances, this is just a strictly worse version of the Fleshmelter Cloak, which is already a relatively marginal effect. D tier. The Cloak of Displacement. The Cloak of Displacement gives you, at the beginning of the wearer's turn, so at the beginning of each of your turns, and there's no cooldown on this effect, so it's every single turn, when you're in combat, the cloak activates, giving enemies disadvantage on attacks against you. The effect goes away when you take damage. The damage doesn't have to be from a successful attack roll. It can be any source of damage, and that will dispel the displacement effect. But otherwise, enemies just have permanent disadvantage on attack rolls against you until they hit you. This is obviously super powerful on any character that is not going to get hit that frequently. So it's very, very good on spellcasters, both because it prevents them from getting hit, but also because enemies in Baldur's Gate will tend not to target characters they have disadvantage against, because the AI prioritizes attacking characters that it can hit easily, and prioritizes attacking with advantage and deprioritizes attacking with disadvantage. So it will just cause enemies not to target your vulnerable characters if they have the Cloak of Displacement equipped. This can help you maintain concentration on spells by avoiding getting hit. It can help you turn a high defense character with high AC into being basically impossible to hit, or turn a low defense character into one that enemies won't want to target, which can help you redirect enemy AI. This is exactly the kind of defensive effect that we're looking for, because it solves a huge defensive problem all by itself, or turns a character with powerful defenses into one that's basically invincible, while giving you a bunch of secondary effects as well. Disadvantage on attack rolls against you also means enemies are much less likely to critically hit, which is very good, of course, if you're a defensively oriented character. If you have high AC, sometimes the only way they can hurt you is with critical hits, so the Cloak of Displacement makes those much less likely. Overall, this is such a powerful effect that the Cloak of Displacement is going to be featured in, I think, 100% of parties. We're putting it straight into S tier, but the only complicated decision with this item is whether you use it on a low defense character to try to cause enemies not to target them, or a high defense character to make them almost invincible. That's going to depend a little bit on your party setup, but either way, the Cloak of Displacement is going to be absolutely excellent, and goes straight into S tier. The Cloak of the Weave. The Cloak of the Weave does exactly the same thing as the Cloak of Elemental Absorption, letting you take half damage from an elemental attack once per short rest, but also gives you +1 to spell save DC and spell attack rolls. +1 to save DC and attack rolls is obviously amazing for any caster, and so the Cloak of the Weave is just going to be really, really good for caster builds. The Elemental Absorption effect is a nice bonus for those characters as well, who will tend to be targeted rarely, but who you really don't want to take heavy burst damage. So being able to absorb if they get caught in a fireball or get hit by a powerful spell, the Cloak of the Weave can help you stay alive while providing strong offensive bonuses. Boosts to your save DC are one of the most valuable things that a casters can have. Boosts to your spell attack rolls are of course always nice, and this gives you all of those in an item slot that you normally won't be making heavy use of, and gives you a nice defensive bonus in addition to that. For that reason, the Cloak of the Weave is of course S tier for any caster, and is going to be best in slot for casters in the endgame. The Mantle of the Holy Warrior. This cloak gives you the ability to cast Crusader's Mantle, the level 3 paladin spell, once per short rest. So it's effectively 3 level 3 spell slots per day already, which is pretty nice. You might think I wouldn't like this item particularly because Crusader's Mantle is not, generally speaking, a very powerful spell, but when you don't have to spend a spell slot on it, a lot of things get more interesting. This can be used on any character that doesn't have other things to concentrate on to cast Crusader's Mantle, which increases the damage output of your party pretty significantly if you're making a lot of attacks. It deals an additional 1d4 radiant damage on all of your party's attacks, which can add up pretty quickly if you have an offense-focused party. It gets even more powerful if you have summons, because those also get the Crusader's Mantle benefits. So the Mantle of the Holy Warrior can power up your entire party massively if you have that available, and is much, much better than spending a level 3 spell slot on this, because most characters are going to have more valuable uses for their spell slots, but getting this from an item makes it actually quite excellent. For that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier, best for parties that have a lot of summons, but also very good for parties that have just any character that attacks multiple times per turn. You can place this on a character that wouldn't normally be concentrating on something to give them a powerful effect to concentrate on, and cast it before combat starts in order to gain a significant benefit. Mantle of the Holy Warrior, just a very good item. Keep it on your melee characters and use it regularly. The Nymph Cloak. The Nymph Cloak allows you to cast Dominate Person once per long rest. Dominate Person is normally a level 5 spell, so obviously this gives you a pretty powerful spell slot, but unfortunately you're spending it to cast Dominate Person. It's not that Dominate Person is a bad spell, in fact it's a pretty powerful spell when it actually lands, but spending your concentration and an action on it is not always valuable anyways, so a lot of times you'd be better off just with the passive benefits of this cloak. You can of course of a different cloak. You can of course use this for one fight and then unequip it and swap out to a different cloak for the rest of the day. And of course if you're going into a fight with a lot of powerful humanoids, then the Nymph Cloak can give you an edge in that fight. Notably, this item uses your item save DC, so it's going to be much worse for characters without high mental stats, so it's not going to work very well on a melee character typically, and it's going to be worse for some multi-class builds who will have lower item save DCs because of the complicated way that Baldur's Gate calculates item save DCs, so best to use this on a mono-class caster. But if you do that, then you're giving up on the Cloak of the Weave for that fight, or the Cloak of Displacement for that fight, and so generally speaking, the Nymph Cloak is only going to come up in some rare encounters. Dominate Person, though, pretty powerful spell, so if you can land it, it's not bad. I'm going to put it in B tier, though I think C tier would also be fine for this item, but because it is a powerful effect, I think you can get some value out of it on occasion. The main thing holding this back is that it uses your item save DC, so for characters that can use it, it's okay, and that it of course has the opportunity cost of not allowing you to cast, to wear a different cloak. The Reverse Rain Cloak. The Reverse Rain Cloak makes you permanently wet, so everyone have fun in the comments with that one. The Reverse Rain Cloak gives you the wet condition all the time. So you have resistance to fire damage, and cannot be set on fire, but also vulnerability to lightning and cold damage. Now, typically in Dungeons & Dragons, vulnerability is much worse than resistance is good. And there's two reasons for this. One is simple math. When you're doubling damage, it increases the damage by more than having the damage decreases it. Like if you were taking 50 damage and you double it, then you take an additional 50 damage. If you have it, you only prevent 25 damage. So vulnerability has a larger effect in terms of absolute damage increases than resistance does. It's also worse for you because it removes predictability, and predictability is something that you really should strive for when you're optimizing. Having the possibility of large bursts of incoming damage is much more dangerous than making it less likely that you take medium amounts of damage. So having the damage that you're taking from fire is much less valuable in terms of predicting whether you're going to be able to survive a fight, then doubling the damage from cold and lightning makes it less predictable. Now, this is a little bit misleading because, of course, fire damage is a much, much more common damage type in most encounters than lightning and cold damage. Fire damage is by far the most common elemental damage. So you will often be able to gain value from fire resistance and not have to worry about lightning and cold damage if you are able to determine what type of damage an enemy is doing in advance. That being said, that's something that you don't necessarily always have access to. Some enemies have spells that do both, so you could run into things. You don't want to have to memorize every encounter to decide whether you want to wear the Reverse Rain Cloak for it or not. So in general, for constant usage, I would suggest avoiding it. Only put it on if you're going into a fight where you know you're going to be taking a lot of fire damage, and typically there's better ways to gain fire resistance than this that don't put you in danger of just getting obliterated. However, there is one cool combo with the Reverse Rain Cloak that you can make use of, and that's with the Pyro Quickness Hat. The Pyro Quickness Hat gives you an additional bonus action whenever you deal fire damage with a spell. Extra bonus actions are of course very powerful. This is especially useful for a sorcerer who can use that bonus action to cast another quickened spell, and for a fire sorcerer in particular, because you can use Scorching Ray, gain another bonus action, cast an extra quickened Scorching Ray, and so on. The downside of the Pyro Quickness Hat is that you set yourself on fire every time it triggers, and if you're using Scorching Ray, you're going to take the initial fire damage many times over, one for each ray. So you can take a ton of additional damage from setting yourself on fire with the Pyro Quickness Hat, which the Reverse Rain Cloak completely prevents. So for a fire sorcerer, sometimes being permanently wet can keep you from setting yourself on fire if you're using exactly that specific item combo, and that can be very powerful in order to optimize one of the highest damage characters in the game. That being said, there's a lot of other ways to gain immunity to burning damage or enough damage resistance that it can't hurt you, which lets you, maintain concentration and not just lower your hit points a lot. So the Reverse Rain Cloak is a cool combination for that specific character, and occasionally has uses for preventing fire damage in encounters where you're going to take a lot of fire damage, but for the most part is not something that I'd highly recommend, because there's just better ways to get both of its effects. So I'm going to put it in C tier, even for the very specific combo, though it is a very cool combo that is worth playing around with, at least occasionally, just for fun. The Shadeslayer Cloak. The Shadeslayer Cloak reduces the roll that you need to critically hit by 1 whenever you are hiding. So as long as you have the hiding condition, the Shadeslayer Cloak reduces the roll you need to critically hit by 1, increasing your critical hit chance. Obviously, this is really powerful for characters that want to critically hit, so any rogues, any stealth archers, any paladins can benefit from the Shadeslayer Cloak in order to sneak up behind an enemy and wallop them for a critical hit, which of course doubles all of that damage. Critical hit builds are very strong. This particular item that reduces your the roll requirement for a critical hit, that increases your critical hit chance, is a little more situational because you have to be hiding, and most characters, when they attack from hiding, will leave hiding as a result of that attack, so you're only going to get to use it once at the start of combat, or maximum once per turn if you're re-hiding every turn with like a bonus action rogue hide. But even still, increasing your chance to critically hit is still just pretty good, and for a stealth archery build in particular that's going to stay hiding while making attacks, the Shadeslayer Cloak is excellent. For that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier, because it's just a powerful offensive ability for one of the more powerful offensive option for one of the more powerful builds in the game, and just good for a lot of builds that just want to increase their chance of critically hitting, because that will let them one-shot an enemy when combat starts, if they start from hiding, and that of course is a very good thing to do. And finally, the Wavemother's Cloak. The Wavemother's Cloak, at the beginning of your turn in combat, gives you the Water Layer Protection ability, which for some reason is called a totally different thing, but is identical to the Wet condition that you get permanently from the Reverse Rain Cloak. That means, I just want everyone to take a second to think about this, that means that of the 16 magical cloaks in the game, there are 2 cloaks of permanent wetness, so I don't know what they were doing over at Larian, but I guess at least the fanfiction writers are happy. The Wavemother's Cloak is just a worse version of the Reverse Rain Cloak, because it has the same effect, but only in combat, which means that you can't benefit from not setting yourself on fire from the Pyro Quickness Hat if you lead off combat with it. You're never going to need 2 copies of this effect, so the fact that there are 2 of them in the game is kind of silly, and it's going straight into D tier. The only reason you would want this is for the jokes. So, to quickly sum up at the end of Act 3, almost every party, in my opinion, should have these 3 cloaks equipped, and then either Cunning, Brume, Mantle of the Holy Warrior, or Shade Slayer, depending on your exact party composition. By this point, Vivacious Cloak has been sort of overtaken by the other defensive options in terms of providing defensive capabilities, and 8 hit points is significantly less than it was, even when you got it in Act 2. There's a couple other options. Fleshmelter can still be useful for retaliation builds, and Reverse Rain Cloak and Derivation Cloak do have their fun niche item combos, but other than that, you're just going to be going with the most powerful cloaks at the top of the tiers. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at all of the cloaks. This is not the most numerous item slot, but it is one of the ones where I think you can gain amongst the biggest edge by understanding which are good, because the difference between the good cloaks at the top and the bad cloaks is some of the widest difference in items. The bad cloaks are really, really bad, and the good ones are really good. So hopefully this will be helpful to make sure that you have your party appropriately garbed. As always, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out, of course, with the algorithm. And definitely let me know if you think I should move something around here, if I've missed a use for one of these items. I'm always open to making corrections or moving things around, so definitely do not hesitate to let me know if you think I've made a mistake. Cheers, my friends, and I will catch you next time.